You're holding me back.
Every contract ends with the same signature.
Whose?
Your ex-husband's.
Jonathan Wright was 44, a commercial contracts manager in Columbus, Ohio. Most people believed he was the kind of man whose life had settled years ago. His neighbors saw the same aging silver Toyota Avalon every morning, the same brown leather lunch bag, the same quiet smile as he left work at exactly 5:15 every afternoon. Even his wife, Ellie Harper Wright, had started believing she had outgrown him. What nobody knew was that Jonathan's signature quietly unlocked billion-dollar agreements across America's corporate landscape. As Ellie slid the divorce petition across the polished oak table and whispered, "You're holding me back," Jonathan's encrypted executive tablet vibrated once. Final executive authorization required. If you're watching today, I'd love to know where you're joining from. Drop your country and your local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy slow-burning stories where quiet people change everything without raising their voices, consider subscribing so you won't miss tomorrow's story. 5 years earlier, there had been no obvious cracks in Jonathan Wright and Ellie's marriage. If anyone had visited their 2-story brick home in Dublin, a quiet suburb just outside Columbus, they would have seen the picture of a stable American family. Fresh flowers sat on the kitchen island every Friday. Jonathan brewed coffee before sunrise every morning. Ellie liked opening the back patio doors while checking emails before work. Their lives followed routines that seemed ordinary enough to last forever. Jonathan never believed that love needed to be loud. He noticed the little things instead. He remembered how Ellie preferred almond milk in her coffee after a stressful investor meeting. He knew she worked better in complete silence whenever she prepared presentations. Every Sunday evening before the work week began, he filled her car with gas without mentioning it. By Monday morning, she simply assumed the tank had somehow stayed full. He never corrected her. When Harper Biotechnologies existed only as a sketch inside a leather notebook, Jonathan had been the first person to tell her it could become something real. "You've been talking about this for 3 years," he had told her one rainy October evening while they sat at their kitchen table. "Maybe it's time to stop talking." Ellie looked across the table. "You really think I could build it?" Jonathan smiled. "I think you've already built it. Everyone else just hasn't seen it yet." That single sentence stayed with her for months. When she finally resigned from her pharmaceutical research position, Jonathan quietly became the safety net beneath every risk she took. Their savings covered nearly 18 months of living expenses. Jonathan had built those savings over years. No vacations, no luxury cars, no unnecessary debt. While friends upgraded homes and leased imported SUVs, Jonathan continued driving his aging Toyota Avalon. Ellie laughed about it sometimes. "You know, people think we're struggling when they see that car." Jonathan would shrug. "It still starts every morning." She rolled her eyes, smiling. "You always have the least exciting answer." He simply smiled back. He had learned years earlier that not every observation required a defense. During Harper Biotechnology's first year, Jonathan never appeared in company photos. He never attended networking events. He rarely entered Ellie's office. Yet he quietly solved problems before they ever reached her desk. One supplier agreement contained a clause allowing annual price increases without notice. Jonathan spotted it during dinner. He read the contract while Ellie answered emails. He circled one paragraph. "You may want Brian to revise Section 8. Ellie barely looked up. "What's wrong with it?" "If raw material prices increase, they can terminate your pricing guarantee immediately." The next afternoon, Brian Foster Harper, Biotechnology's outside corporate attorney, called Ellie. "I have no idea how Jonathan caught that." Ellie smiled proudly. "He reads everything." Another week, Jonathan introduced Ellie to an experienced insurance broker he had met years earlier through professional contacts. He never explained how he knew the man. The broker negotiated coverage that ultimately saved Harper Biotechnologies nearly $180,000 during its second year. Ellie thanked the broker. She never asked how Jonathan had known exactly whom to call. Jonathan preferred it that way. Success in his mind did not require applause. As Harper Biotechnologies expanded, so did Ellie's confidence. Then the attention arrived. Local business journals began featuring her. Startup podcasts invited her for interviews. Women's leadership conferences requested keynote speeches. Investors praised her vision. Photographers followed her through laboratories wearing crisp white coats she rarely had time to use anymore. The company was becoming successful. Very successful. That success also changed the people surrounding her. Mason Caldwell entered first. He represented Caldwell Venture Partners, one of the Midwest's largest venture investment firms. Mason wore expensive Navy suits tailored in Chicago. His watches cost more than Jonathan's car. Every conversation sounded like a motivational speech. He admired aggressive founders, fast decisions, fast growth, fast exits. One afternoon, after a board meeting, Mason joined Ellie for coffee. "You've built something impressive." "Thank you." "But," Ellie laughed, "there's always a but." "There is." He leaned forward. "The biggest threat to visionary founders isn't competition." "What is it?" "Comfort." She looked curious. People who accept average lives eventually convince extraordinary people to slow down. Ellie remained silent. Mason stirred his espresso. "I've seen it happen dozens of times." He never mentioned Jonathan directly. He didn't need to. The seed had already been planted. Rachel Simmons noticed the change long before Jonathan did. Rachel had joined Harper Biotechnologies as Chief Operating Officer during its second year. Unlike Mason, Rachel valued preparation over excitement. She respected Jonathan. One evening, she found Ellie staring through the office windows after everyone else had gone home. "You okay?" Ellie sighed. "I don't know." Rachel waited. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living two different lives." "What do you mean?" "At work, everything moves so fast." "And at home?" "Everything slows down." Rachel smiled. "That doesn't sound terrible." Ellie shook her head. "You don't understand." She hesitated. "I spend all day talking with CEOs, investors, founders, and then I come home to someone who's perfectly happy eating homemade chili and watching baseball." Rachel looked out toward downtown Columbus. "Maybe that's balance." Ellie didn't answer, because she no longer wanted balance. She wanted acceleration. Jonathan noticed the later dinners, the canceled weekends, the constant business trips, the phone that never stopped vibrating. Yet he never complained. Instead, he adjusted. He learned to cook meals that reheated well. He folded laundry before she returned. He left handwritten notes beside the coffee maker whenever she flew to Boston or San Francisco. "Safe travels. Good luck today. Proud of you." Most of those notes ended up forgotten inside briefcases. He never asked whether she had read them. Months passed, then nearly 2 years. Harper Biotechnologies doubled in revenue. Another investment round closed. Ellie hired nearly 80 employees. Her calendar filled 6 weeks ahead. Jonathan's remained almost unchanged. Every morning at 6, coffee, run 3 miles, work, home, dinner, read, sleep. From the outside, his life appeared frozen, while hers accelerated beyond recognition. Even neighbors began making comments. During a neighborhood barbecue, one guest asked Ellie, "So when are you finally convincing Jonathan to quit that office job and work for you?" Everyone laughed politely. Jonathan laughed too. "I think they're doing just fine without me." Nobody noticed that Ellie didn't laugh. Driving home later that evening, she stared through the windshield. "You know," Jonathan glanced over. What? You could probably do more. He kept both hands on the steering wheel. In what way? I don't know. She searched for words. Just more. He nodded once. I like what I do. I know. But sometimes I wonder if you like being invisible. Jonathan thought for several seconds before answering. Visibility isn't the same thing as value. Ellie looked away. She didn't agree. She had spent too much time inside boardrooms where visibility created opportunity. She had begun believing recognition and importance were the same thing. Jonathan sensed the conversation ending. He didn't force another. That had always been his way. He believed people revealed themselves when silence became comfortable. Instead, silence became distance. A few weeks later, Harper Biotechnologies hosted its annual investor reception inside a renovated warehouse overlooking the Scioto River. Jonathan attended because Ellie asked him to. He stood near the back of the room with a glass of sparkling water, while Ellie greeted executives, scientists, and reporters. Nobody ignored him intentionally. They simply overlooked him. Mason walked over with a confident smile. You must be Jonathan. Jonathan extended his hand. Nice meeting you. I've heard a lot about you. I hope all good things. Mason smiled politely. I'm sure Ellie appreciates your support. Jonathan nodded. I appreciate hers too. Mason looked toward Ellie, speaking confidently beneath the company logo. She's going places. Jonathan followed his gaze. I know. I just hope nothing slows her down. Jonathan met Mason's eyes for a brief second. Then he simply smiled. So do I. Later that night, after the guests had gone home and the silence returned to their kitchen, Ellie stood with her back to him, looking out into the darkness beyond the window. Jonathan quietly placed 2 mugs of tea on the counter. She never touched hers. Without turning around, she finally spoke the sentence that had been growing inside her for months. Jonathan. He looked up. I think you're holding me back. Jonathan did not answer immediately. He stood beside the kitchen counter, one hand resting lightly on the mug Ellie had never touched. Steam continued rising from the tea between them, disappearing into the silence that had slowly replaced conversation over the past 2 years. He studied her face, not searching for anger, searching for certainty. People often mistook Jonathan's quietness for hesitation. It was neither. He had simply learned that the first response was rarely the best one. Finally, he spoke. What makes you believe that? Ellie remained facing the dark backyard. I've been asking myself that for months. And I think I finally know. Jonathan waited. She turned around slowly. I don't belong in the life we've built anymore. The words landed softly. That somehow made them heavier. Jonathan nodded once. Do you mean this house? No. Our routines? No. You mean me? She held his eyes. Yes. There was no accusation in her voice now, only conviction. Jonathan looked down at the untouched tea before lifting it and pouring it into the sink. He rinsed the mug, placed it upside down on the drying rack. Only then did he speak again. If you've already decided, she interrupted gently. I have. Then there's probably nothing I can say tonight that would change your mind? She lowered her eyes. I don't think there is. He accepted that answer without visible disappointment, not because it didn't hurt, because he had sensed it coming long before she found the words. That night they slept in separate bedrooms for the first time in their marriage. Jonathan lay awake staring at the ceiling. His thoughts never drifted toward revenge. Instead, they wandered through memories. Ellie's first laboratory, their honeymoon along Lake Michigan, the day she received her first patent approval, the night they celebrated hiring employee number 10. Every memory ended the same way. She had smiled. He realized he could no longer remember the last time she smiled because of him. The following morning looked almost identical to every other weekday. Jonathan woke at 6. He brewed coffee. He ran exactly 3 miles through the quiet streets of Dublin. He returned home sweating lightly as the neighborhood slowly came alive. Inside the house, Ellie was already dressed for work. A navy pantsuit, hair tied neatly, laptop bag over one shoulder. They exchanged polite greetings. Nothing more. When Jonathan reached for the coffee maker, he noticed she had already packed 2 mugs instead of 1. One habit had already disappeared overnight. During breakfast, neither mentioned the previous evening. Instead, Ellie reviewed investor schedules. Jonathan read the business section of the Columbus Dispatch. At exactly 7:42 a.m., Ellie stood. "I'll be home late." Jonathan folded his newspaper. "Drive safely." She hesitated for only a second before leaving. The garage door closed. Jonathan remained seated another minute. Then he quietly finished his coffee. 3 weeks passed. Nothing improved. Nothing exploded. The marriage simply continued existing without warmth. Friends noticed. Jonathan's younger sister, Melissa Wright, invited them to dinner one Saturday. Melissa taught 4th grade outside Cincinnati. Unlike Jonathan, she had never hidden what she thought. Halfway through dinner, she looked from one to the other. "You two seem exhausted." Ellie forced a smile. "Busy." Melissa wasn't convinced. "You've both been busy for years." Jonathan changed the subject. "How's Ethan enjoying middle school?" Melissa immediately understood. Jonathan wasn't avoiding conflict. He was protecting everyone at the table from it. After dinner, while Ellie answered another business call outside, Melissa quietly joined Jonathan on the back porch. "Is everything okay?" Jonathan watched children riding bicycles across the street. "No." "Can you fix it?" He considered the question. "I don't think both people are trying to fix it." Melissa placed one hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry." He smiled faintly. "So am I." Harper Biotechnologies continued growing. Revenue climbed another 30%. A second laboratory opened outside Cleveland. Business magazines began calling Ellie one of Ohio's fastest-rising executives. Every article used words like visionary, bold, fearless, transformational. Jonathan clipped every article. He placed them carefully inside a folder in his desk. He never showed Ellie. He assumed she had already seen them. One Thursday afternoon, Jonathan received a phone call while reviewing supplier agreements. The screen displayed a familiar name: Rebecca Lawson. Most people knew Rebecca as one of Columbus's most respected family law attorneys. Jonathan had known her much longer, not socially, professionally. "Jonathan." "Rebecca." "It's been a while." "It has. What can I do for you?" "I actually wondered if you had time for lunch tomorrow." He looked at his calendar. "Noon. Perfect." She paused. "I think you'll understand why once we talk." Jonathan didn't ask further questions. Rebecca rarely called without reason. The following afternoon, they met inside a quiet restaurant near German Village. Rebecca arrived carrying only a leather portfolio. No briefcase, no laptop. That alone told Jonathan this wasn't business. After ordering lunch, she opened the folder. "I received a consultation request." Jonathan already knew. "Ellie?" Rebecca nodded. "She hasn't retained me." "No. Another attorney." Jonathan stirred his iced tea. "I assumed she would." Rebecca watched him carefully. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not." She slid a business card across the table. Daniel Pierce, Family Law, Columbus. Jonathan recognized the name. A competent attorney, professional, reasonable. Rebecca folded her hands. "She intends to file." Jonathan nodded once. "I understand." Rebecca waited for anger. It never arrived. "You aren't going to ask why?" Jonathan looked toward the restaurant window. "I already know why." "You do?" "At least I know what she believes." Rebecca sighed softly. You realize this could become complicated. It doesn't have to. She leaned forward. Jonathan. What? You've accumulated significant business interests over the last 20 years. He smiled slightly. I'm aware. You should prepare. I already have. Rebecca looked surprised. You have? For years. She closed the folder again. Sometimes Jonathan answered questions in ways that made them sound simpler than they truly were. She had practiced law long enough to recognize hidden preparation. Have you ever considered, she asked carefully, that maybe you've spent too much time preparing for every possibility? Jonathan smiled politely. Preparation doesn't mean expectation. What does it mean? It means panic isn't necessary when difficult days finally arrive. Rebecca studied him. She realized something. Jonathan wasn't emotionally detached. He was emotionally disciplined. There was a difference. The divorce petition arrived 11 days later. A process server knocked politely at Jonathan's office shortly after lunch. Several coworkers glanced toward the doorway. Jonathan thanked the man, signed the acknowledgement, returned quietly to his desk. He finished reviewing the contract already open on his computer before opening the envelope. No dramatic reaction. No visible frustration. Just careful reading. When he arrived home that evening, Ellie was waiting in the living room. I didn't want you hearing about it from someone else. I didn't. She swallowed. I'm sorry. Jonathan placed the envelope on the coffee table. I believe you are. She looked surprised. You do. I don't think you'd apologize if this were easy. Tears briefly formed in her eyes before disappearing. He gently raised one hand. You don't have to explain. I feel like I should. You've already made your decision. She nodded. Yes. Then explanations won't change it. Silence settled again. Finally, Jonathan asked one question. When would you like to move forward? She blinked. You're not going to fight this. I don't see the value. You aren't angry. He looked directly at her. I'm sad. The honesty caught her completely off guard. But sadness and conflict aren't the same thing. Over the next several weeks, Daniel Pierce sent requests for financial disclosures, retirement accounts, property records, and business interests. Jonathan responded to every deadline early. Rebecca noticed. You've organized every document. I keep good records. You've divided everything into indexed folders. Jonathan nodded. It makes everyone's job easier. Daniel Pierce privately told Ellie, after reviewing the disclosures, I've rarely seen someone cooperate this completely. Ellie expected hidden assets, arguments, delays. Instead, Jonathan voluntarily disclosed every jointly owned account. The family home, investment portfolios, vehicles, savings, retirement funds, everything. He requested only 3 things remain entirely his. His personal apartment investment purchased before marriage. His retirement account accumulated before their wedding. His privately held business interests. Daniel reviewed the paperwork. Everything appeared perfectly documented, perfectly legal, perfectly ordinary. Ellie signed the preliminary settlement, believing Jonathan had surrendered far more easily than she expected. She walked out of the courthouse convinced she was finally free to move toward the future she deserved. Jonathan watched her leave through the courthouse windows. Then his phone vibrated once. Not a text, not an email. A secure executive calendar notification. Executive Governance Committee. Monday. 7:00 a.m. attendance required. Jonathan slipped the phone back into his pocket and quietly walked toward his aging Toyota Avalon. Monday morning arrived with the same quiet precision that governed nearly every part of Jonathan Wright's life. At 5:45 a.m., the alarm sounded once. He was already awake. By 6 o'clock, he had finished his morning run through the tree-lined streets of downtown Columbus. 20 minutes later, he stood in his apartment kitchen preparing oatmeal and black coffee while the local morning news played softly in the background. The anchor spent 3 full minutes discussing Harper Biotechnologies. A photograph of Ellie filled the television screen. The Columbus-based biotech company announced plans Friday to expand manufacturing into Indiana and Pennsylvania after securing another round of private investment. Jonathan looked up for only a moment. He listened without changing expression. The report praised Ellie's leadership, her determination, her vision. Every compliment was deserved. She had worked relentlessly for years to build the company. Jonathan quietly turned the television off before the interview ended. At exactly 6:45, he locked his apartment and walked toward the parking garage. The silver Toyota Avalon started on the first turn of the key, just as it always had. 40 minutes later, instead of driving toward the modest office building where his co-workers believed he spent every Monday morning, Jonathan entered the underground parking garage of a 28-story glass tower overlooking the Scioto River. No company logo appeared outside. No advertising banners. Only polished granite walls and a bronze plaque beside the private entrance. Wright Strategic Compliance Group, nothing more. No slogan, no list of services, no indication that the company quietly influenced billions of dollars in commercial transactions every year. Jonathan parked in space number 7. He carried no briefcase, only a slim leather portfolio. The security officer behind the private reception desk immediately stood. "Good morning, Mr. Wright." "Morning, David. Executive committee is already gathering." Jonathan nodded. "They're early." David smiled. "They usually are." The private elevator required 2 separate security credentials. Jonathan tapped one card, placed his thumb against the biometric scanner. The elevator doors opened without a sound. Floor 26, Executive Governance Division. The doors slid apart into a reception area unlike anything Ellie had ever imagined. No marble fountains. No expensive artwork displayed to impress visitors. Instead, rows of glass-walled conference rooms overlooked Columbus through floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything looked clean, orderly, purpose-built. Employees walked quietly between offices carrying contracts instead of laptops filled with presentations. Nobody rushed. Nobody raised their voice. Efficiency had replaced urgency. A receptionist looked up immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Wright." "Morning, Sarah. Your review folders are already inside." "Thank you." As Jonathan walked through the executive floor, employees greeted him naturally, not with fear, not with exaggerated respect, simply with quiet professionalism. He knew nearly every name, and more importantly, he remembered details about their families. "How's your father's recovery?" "Michael?" "Much better. Thank you for asking." "Emily, congratulations on your daughter's graduation." Her face brightened. "She starts Ohio State in August." Jonathan smiled. "She'll do well." These conversations lasted only seconds, yet they explained why employee turnover inside Wright Strategic Compliance Group remained among the lowest in the industry. People stayed because they trusted leadership, not because leadership demanded loyalty. Conference Room 3 overlooked the river. 8 executives were already seated. Jonathan entered precisely at 7. Nobody checked the clock. Everyone knew he never arrived late. Margaret Ellis, Director of Regulatory Compliance, began immediately. "Morning, Jonathan." "Morning." She handed him the first folder. 47 executive approvals today. Jonathan opened it. Each contract had already passed through multiple departments: financial review, legal review, risk assessment, regulatory verification, insurance validation, cybersecurity compliance, environmental compliance where required. Jonathan represented the final safeguard. Not the first, the last. If a contract reached his desk, millions of dollars had already been invested in making sure it deserved approval. or rejection. Across the table sat Robert Kim, Chief Legal Officer. "We closed the Denver hospital acquisition Friday." Jonathan nodded. "Any post-closing issues?" "None." "The Texas manufacturing merger, completed." "The Michigan pharmaceutical licensing package," Robert smiled, "approved by federal regulators yesterday." Jonathan simply marked each report complete. No celebration. Successful compliance meant the system had functioned exactly as intended. The meeting continued for nearly an hour. Every discussion centered on documentation, verification, evidence. Nobody discussed personalities. Nobody cared who the client was, only whether every requirement had been satisfied. That principle had guided Jonathan since founding the company 20 years earlier. He still remembered the conversation that inspired it. He had been 24, working as a junior contract analyst. A major healthcare company lost nearly $80 million because one executive approved an agreement without verifying supplier certifications. Everyone blamed the individual. Jonathan blamed the system. People made mistakes. Systems were supposed to catch them. If they failed, the system needed improvement, not louder executives. That belief eventually became Wright Strategic Compliance Group, a company built almost entirely around one simple idea: evidence before approval. Always. The executive meeting concluded at 8:12. Most participants left for their departments. Margaret remained behind. "One more item." Jonathan closed his notebook. "What is it?" She handed him a thinner blue folder. "New regional expansion." Jonathan glanced at the cover. Harper Biotechnologies. For the first time that morning, his hand stopped moving, only briefly, less than 2 seconds. Margaret noticed nothing unusual. "Medical manufacturing expansion?" Jonathan asked. She nodded. "Indiana?" He opened the file. Inside were preliminary summaries, manufacturing agreements, equipment financing, distribution partnerships, commercial liability coverage, laboratory certifications, everything necessary for a multi-state expansion. Nothing had reached executive approval yet. This represented only the initial intake review. Jonathan turned the pages carefully. Every page looked ordinary, professional, well prepared. Then he reached the executive summary. Chief Executive Officer, Ellie Harper. She had resumed using her maiden name professionally after the divorce. Jonathan looked at the name without emotion, then continued reading. Margaret watched him. "Anything stand out?" "Not yet." "High-profile client?" "So I've heard." She smiled. "Business journals can't stop talking about them." Jonathan closed the folder. "They're not our client." Margaret looked confused. "No. Our client is the contract." She smiled. "I always forget you'll answer that way." Jonathan stood. "When legal review finishes, send it through the normal process. No special handling. No. No priority." He looked at her. "Does the policy mention priority for newspaper articles?" She laughed quietly. "I suppose not. It doesn't mention famous CEOs either. I'll process it normally." "Thank you." She collected the folder. Neither of them discussed Ellie again. By mid-morning, Jonathan returned to his office. Unlike most executive offices, it contained very little decoration. One bookshelf, one conference table, one framed photograph. The picture showed Jonathan standing beside an older man wearing a faded construction jacket. His father. Taken nearly 25 years earlier, on the day Jonathan graduated from Ohio State University's business school. His father had spent 37 years repairing bridges across Ohio. He often repeated the same sentence whenever Jonathan complained about difficult work. "The strongest bridge isn't the prettiest one." Jonathan had never forgotten it. He built his company the same way. No unnecessary decoration. Only strength. Around noon, Sarah knocked lightly. "Your afternoon executive approvals are ready." She placed another stack of files on his desk. Nearly 40 contracts. Jonathan reviewed them one by one. Each signature represented responsibility, not authority. He refused to sign quickly simply because someone waited. Late that afternoon, his secure internal system produced a notification. New client review package available. He clicked the file. Harper Biotechnologies. Regional manufacturing expansion. Status preliminary compliance completed. Awaiting executive authorization path assignment. Jonathan read every page carefully. The documentation appeared strong, but several required certifications had not yet been uploaded. Insurance endorsements remained incomplete. One supplier had submitted an expired federal manufacturing registration. None of those issues were unusual. None justified rejection. They simply required correction. Jonathan selected the standard response used for every incomplete submission. Additional documentation required before executive review. No names, no comments, no explanations beyond the documented deficiencies. He clicked Send. The file disappeared from his approval queue. Somewhere across Columbus, Brian Foster would soon receive the automated compliance request. Neither Brian nor Ellie had any idea who had initiated it. Jonathan leaned back in his chair and looked through the office window as the afternoon sun reflected across the river. For him, it was simply another contract. For Ellie, although she did not know it yet, it would become the first obstacle in a journey that would slowly force her to discover the identity of the invisible man standing behind every door she was trying to open. 3 days later, Harper Biotechnologies occupied the front page of the Columbus Business Journal. The headline stretched across nearly half the page. Harper Biotechnologies secures $185 million expansion package. A photograph beneath it showed Ellie standing inside the company's newest laboratory, wearing a white coat and safety glasses. Behind her, rows of stainless steel production equipment reflected the bright overhead lights. She looked exactly like the image investors wanted. Confident, focused, unstoppable. By 8 o'clock that morning, congratulations were arriving faster than emails could be answered. Investment firms, medical suppliers, university researchers, state economic development officials. Everyone wanted to be associated with Ohio's newest success story. Inside the executive conference room, Ellie smiled as Rachel Simmons distributed updated expansion schedules. "This is the biggest quarter we've ever had," Rachel said. She projected a timeline onto the large display. "Manufacturing begins in Indiana by October. Pennsylvania Distribution Center opens in November. Federal licensing review should conclude before Thanksgiving." Brian Foster adjusted his glasses while reviewing another folder. "The legal side is moving well." Ellie looked toward him. "No surprises? Nothing significant?" He hesitated. "Except one compliance request." Ellie barely looked up. "What kind?" "Routine." She continued signing internal documents. "Then handle it." Brian nodded. "Already working on it." No one in the room considered the request important. Companies received compliance questions every week, missing certificates, updated insurance, revised disclosures. The process rarely delayed anything for long. At least that had always been true. Across the city, Jonathan sat inside his office reviewing an unrelated healthcare acquisition. His desk held 3 organized stacks: approved, pending, additional documentation required. Harper Biotechnologies rested inside the third pile, not because Jonathan had placed it there personally. The software had. Every incomplete submission automatically entered the same workflow. Jonathan barely glanced at the company name as he continued reading. Another file demanded his attention: a hospital merger in Indianapolis, then an insurance restructuring in Kentucky, then a pharmaceutical licensing agreement in Michigan. By noon, he had signed 26 executive approvals, rejected none, returned 4 for additional documentation. Harper Biotechnologies happened to be one of them. Nothing more, nothing less. At Harper Biotechnologies, Brian completed every requested revision within 48 hours, updated insurance certificates, corrected supplier registrations, additional liability disclosures. Everything was uploaded into the compliance portal. He expected approval within 2 business days. Instead, another notification arrived. Additional clarification required regarding supplier certification history. Brian frowned. That's odd. Rachel walked into his office. Problem? Not exactly. He pointed toward the monitor. They're requesting historical certification records. Didn't we already provide them? We provided current records. They want more, Brian nodded. Apparently. Rachel crossed her arms. Can you send them? Of course. It'll slow us down. A little. Rachel checked her watch. We're presenting expansion milestones to Mason tomorrow. I'll have everything uploaded tonight. She smiled. I knew you would. Neither of them suspected anything unusual. The request was detailed, professional, specific. Exactly the kind of documentation large compliance firms often required. The following afternoon, Mason Caldwell entered Harper Biotechnologies, carrying his usual energy. He shook hands with nearly everyone before sitting beside Ellie. So, he grinned, ready to become a national company? Ellie laughed. I've been ready. Rachel began presenting operational milestones. Everything looked healthy. Revenue projections, hiring plans, manufacturing schedules, market forecasts. Then Brian cleared his throat. One update. The room became quiet. Our compliance approval timeline has shifted slightly. Mason frowned. How slightly? Maybe 2 weeks. What happened? Additional documentation. Mason leaned back. Government, Brian shook his head. No. Outside compliance review. Mason waved dismissively. Then push them. Brian smiled politely. It doesn't work that way. Everything works some way. Brian chose his next words carefully. This office doesn't appear to negotiate procedures. Mason laughed. Everyone negotiates. Brian wasn't convinced. I don't think these people do. That evening, Jonathan attended no celebrations, no networking dinners, no investor receptions. Instead, he stopped at the same neighborhood grocery store he had visited every Thursday for years. Linda, the cashier, smiled as he unloaded vegetables onto the counter. Same soup this week, Jonathan smiled. Looks that way. You always buy exactly enough ingredients for 5 days. It keeps things simple. She scanned the groceries. My husband says I should meal prep like you. Jonathan laughed quietly. He probably says that after cooking. He does. She handed him the receipt. Have a good evening, Jonathan. You too. Outside light rain had begun falling. Jonathan loaded the groceries into the trunk of the Avalon before driving home through familiar streets. Nothing about his evening suggested he influenced billion-dollar commercial agreements. That anonymity had become comfortable years earlier. Friday morning brought another update from Harper Biotechnologies. Brian had uploaded every requested document. Jonathan opened the file. Everything appeared complete, until page 68. He paused. One supplier's environmental compliance certification expired in 12 days. Ordinarily, that would not matter. Except the proposed manufacturing agreement extended 5 years. The renewal application had been filed. Approval had not. Jonathan highlighted the issue. He checked company policy. Clear. Future compliance could not replace current compliance. He opened the standard template again. Supplier certification must remain valid through execution date. Updated documentation required before authorization. He clicked send. Nothing personal, nothing emotional, simply procedure. At Harper Biotechnologies, Brian stared silently at the notification. Rachel walked in carrying coffee. Good news. Brian slowly turned the monitor toward her. She read the request twice. They found another issue. Apparently, Rachel sighed. Can we fix it? Eventually. When? The supplier needs federal renewal. How long? Brian hesitated. Maybe 3 weeks. Rachel's expression tightened. Mason isn't going to like that. He didn't. Less than an hour later, Mason stood inside Ellie's office. This is ridiculous. Ellie rubbed her temples. I know. Who keeps reviewing these files? Brian answered calmly. I don't know. There has to be a supervisor. There probably is. Call them. I've tried. And they don't discuss active reviews by phone. Mason stared. They refused. They directed us back to the written compliance process. Mason laughed in disbelief. I've invested in companies across 12 states. So, I've never seen anyone operate like this. Brian quietly replied, Neither have I. Ellie looked toward the city skyline outside her office. What exactly are they trying to accomplish? Brian answered honestly. I don't think they're trying to accomplish anything. What do you mean? They're simply following whatever standards they have. Mason shook his head. Nobody follows standards this closely? Brian wasn't so sure. The following Monday, Wright Strategic Compliance Group held its weekly governance review. Margaret entered Jonathan's office carrying several folders. Morning. Morning. Your pending reviews. Jonathan accepted them. Margaret hesitated. Harper Biotechnologies again. Jonathan continued reading another contract. What about them? They've responded quickly every time. They have. Still incomplete. Jonathan nodded. The supplier certification. You noticed. It was difficult not to. Margaret smiled. Most executives would have overlooked it. Jonathan closed the file. That's why it reached us. She leaned against the doorway. You know they're becoming one of Ohio's biggest growth companies. I've read the articles. Some firms might approve first and request corrections later. Jonathan looked directly at her. And if the supplier loses certification next week, she already knew the answer. The client assumes unnecessary risk. He nodded. Our responsibility begins before problems appear. Margaret smiled. Your father said that. Jonathan smiled back. Almost. What did he actually say? He looked toward the framed photograph on his bookshelf. He said strong bridges don't wait until they're collapsing before someone checks the bolts. Margaret laughed softly. That's a good rule. It's kept us in business. After she left, Jonathan returned to his work. Harper Biotechnologies occupied less than 10 minutes of his morning. By lunchtime, he had reviewed 23 unrelated contracts. To him, Ellie was no longer his former wife. She was simply another executive whose company had submitted incomplete documentation. Nothing more. Across Columbus, Ellie sat alone inside her office long after sunset. The expansion calendar hanging on the wall no longer looked certain. Several milestones had quietly shifted. Manufacturing, insurance activation, equipment financing. Everything depended on compliance approval. She opened the latest notification once again. The wording remained cold. Professional, precise. No signatures, no names. Only one sentence at the bottom caught her attention. Executive review, deferred pending compliance completion. She read it 3 times, then looked toward Brian. Whoever is reviewing these files, she paused. They never miss anything. Brian slowly nodded. No. He looked at the growing stack of returned documents. They don't. Neither of them realized that every request, every correction, every delay, no matter how small, ultimately stopped on the desk of one quiet man who still drove the same aging Toyota Avalon home every evening. By the second week of October, Harper Biotechnologies had stopped celebrating milestones. The banners announcing the company's national expansion still hung in the lobby, but no one paused to admire them anymore. Every conversation now ended with the same question. Has compliance approved it yet? The answer never changed. Not yet. Inside the legal department, Brian Foster had begun arriving before sunrise. His office lights were usually the first visible from the parking lot. Entire walls had become covered with checklists, supplier certifications, insurance endorsements, environmental reports, manufacturing registrations, federal disclosures. Every completed item received a green check mark. Yet new requests continued appearing. None contradicted previous ones. None were unreasonable. Each request simply uncovered another detail that had been overlooked. Brian had practiced corporate law for nearly 18 years. He had never encountered a review process this thorough or this disciplined. Rachel Simmons entered his office carrying 2 cups of coffee. You look terrible. Brian accepted one gratefully. I've looked worse. When? Law school, she laughed. Any progress? Brian rubbed his forehead. I've gone through every request. And? They're right. Rachel frowned. What do you mean they're right? I mean, he opened another folder. Or every document they've questioned actually contains an issue. She walked closer. This supplier. The certification expires before production begins. She nodded. The insurance file. The liability language doesn't match Indiana regulations. Rachel sighed. And the equipment lease. Brian turned another page. The financing agreement references an outdated environmental statute. She stared at him. So they're not inventing problems? No. They're finding them. Brian leaned back in his chair. And they're finding every single one. Ellie refused to accept that explanation. She called an emergency executive meeting that afternoon. Mason Caldwell joined by video conference from Chicago. Rachel sat beside Ellie. Brian arrived carrying 3 thick binders. Ellie looked around the conference room. I need answers. Nobody spoke immediately. She continued. We've corrected everything they've requested. Brian carefully chose his words. We've corrected everything they've identified. Isn't that the same thing? No. He opened the first binder. They identify another issue after each correction. Mason leaned toward his camera. That sounds intentional. Brian shook his head. I don't think it is. Then explain it. I can't. Mason folded his arms. I've dealt with compliance firms before. So have I. They don't behave like this. Brian quietly replied, Neither do we. Ellie looked at him. What does that mean? It means, he hesitated, our internal documentation has never been tested this deeply. Silence filled the room. Rachel finally spoke. Are you saying we've become comfortable? Brian nodded. We've been moving very fast. Mason interrupted. Fast companies win. Brian remained calm. Fast companies also make mistakes. Mason didn't like the answer. Ellie noticed. She also noticed something else. For the first time since founding Harper Biotechnologies, Brian looked uncertain. That worried her more than the delayed approvals. Across the city, Jonathan's day looked exactly like every other Tuesday. Morning governance meeting, contract reviews, lunch at his desk, afternoon executive approvals. Nothing about Harper Biotechnologies received special attention. The company simply remained inside the queue alongside dozens of other commercial clients. Jonathan believed consistency protected everyone. The moment one client received different treatment, fairness disappeared. At 1:30, Margaret Ellis entered his office. We've received another update from Harper. Jonathan extended his hand. She gave him the file. They're improving. He opened the revised documentation. Indeed, they were. Every correction had been completed professionally. Jonathan continued reading, page after page. Everything appeared stronger than before. Then he reached the transportation agreements. He stopped. What is it? Margaret asked. Jonathan pointed toward one paragraph. The cold chain logistics provider. She leaned closer. What about it? They've subcontracted storage. So, the subcontractor hasn't completed FDA temperature validation. Margaret scanned the page. I missed that. So did legal. She looked surprised. So did financial review. Jonathan closed the folder. It still needs correction. Margaret slowly exhaled. They're going to hate us. Jonathan smiled faintly. They don't know us. No. They know the process. He returned the file. Send the standard request. No phone call, no. No explanation. The documentation explains everything. Margaret nodded. She had worked beside Jonathan for 11 years. She had never once seen him bend procedure because someone complained. Not once. By Wednesday morning, Brian received another notification. He didn't even open it immediately. He simply stared at the screen. Rachel walked in. Another one? He nodded. You haven't opened it. I already know. She sat down. Know what? They found something else. He clicked. Both of them silently read the message. Additional validation required for third-party cold chain storage certification. Rachel slowly lowered her coffee. How? Brian leaned back. I honestly don't know anymore. She whispered, I didn't even realize we used a subcontractor. Brian laughed once. Neither did I. Later that afternoon, Mason arrived unexpectedly from Chicago. He walked directly into Ellie's office without removing his coat. This has gone far enough. Ellie looked up. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting someone is slowing this expansion. Brian entered moments later. Mason turned toward him. Who signs these reviews? Brian answered honestly. I don't know. Find out. I've tried. Try harder. Brian's voice remained steady. The review system doesn't disclose executive identities. Mason frowned. Every system has people behind it. I'm sure it does. Then reach one. Brian shook his head. I've spoken with their administrative office. And they said executive reviewers do not communicate with applicants during active compliance reviews. Mason stared. That's absurd. Brian quietly replied, No. What? It's disciplined. The room became silent. Ellie looked between them. Are we saying nobody can call this person? Brian nodded. Correct. No meetings? No. No negotiations? No. No exceptions? Brian looked directly at Ellie. I don't think exceptions exist. That evening, Jonathan drove home through steady autumn rain. Traffic moved slowly along Interstate 670. Most drivers seemed impatient. Jonathan wasn't. His phone remained inside the center console. He never answered work calls while driving. At a red light, he noticed flashing police lights ahead. A delivery truck had collided with another vehicle. Nothing serious, but traffic backed up for nearly 20 minutes. Jonathan watched emergency responders carefully directing cars around the accident. One small mistake. Hundreds of delayed commuters. He found himself thinking about contracts. People often complained when approval took extra time. Nobody complained when careful preparation prevented disaster. The irony never escaped him. Thursday morning brought another internal governance meeting. Robert Kim entered, carrying quarterly statistics. Our average executive approval time has increased. Jonathan looked up. By how much? 4%. Reason? Robert smiled. You. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Explain. You've returned more contracts for documentation than last quarter. Jonathan reviewed the report. The quality has declined. Robert nodded. It has. Then the approval time should increase. Robert laughed softly. I knew you'd say that. Margaret joined the discussion. Some clients have complained. Jonathan looked toward her. Have any complaints identified factual errors? No. Have any reviews been overturned? No. Any litigation? None. Jonathan closed the report. Then the process is working. Robert leaned back. Sometimes I think you're the only executive I know who isn't impressed by speed. Jonathan smiled. I'm impressed by accuracy. That same afternoon, Harper Biotechnologies received troubling news. One manufacturing partner informed them production equipment could not remain reserved indefinitely. Another bank requested updated financing timelines. Insurance activation dates also began approaching expiration. Nothing had collapsed. Yet. Pressure was building from every direction. Rachel quietly entered Ellie's office, carrying revised schedules. We've lost another week. Ellie looked exhausted. How many now? Rachel answered softly. 5. Ellie closed her eyes. What are we missing? I don't know. Brian appeared moments later. He looked unusually serious. I've been reviewing every returned file. Ellie looked up, and I noticed something. What? Brian spread several approval requests across her desk. They're all written by different departments. Rachel nodded. Okay. But, he tapped the bottom corner of every document. They all originate from the same executive authorization office. Ellie leaned forward. You can tell that. The routing code. Rachel looked closer. What does it mean? Brian stared thoughtfully at the identical reference numbers. It means every one of our contracts. He paused. Eventually reaches the same person. Ellie slowly looked at the growing stack of returned files. For the first time, she stopped blaming the system. Someone somewhere was reviewing every document her company submitted. Someone meticulous, someone invisible, someone whose standards never changed. She had no idea who that person was. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. If Harper Biotechnologies wanted to move forward, they would eventually have to find the unseen gatekeeper standing at the end of every contract. The realization changed everything. Until that Thursday evening, Harper Biotechnologies had treated the delays as a bureaucratic problem. Now they believed there was a person behind the process, an individual, a final decision-maker, someone whose judgment determined whether millions of dollars moved forward or remained frozen. Ellie stood in front of the conference room windows, watching the lights of downtown Columbus reflect against the Scioto River. We find them. Brian Foster looked up from his notebook. It won't be easy. I didn't ask whether it would be easy. Rachel Simmons remained silent. She understood Ellie well enough to recognize that tone. The decision had already been made. Mason Caldwell leaned back confidently. Every organization has a chain of command. Brian nodded. Yes. So we climb it. Brian hesitated. I've already tried. Mason smiled. You called reception. I spoke with legal administration. And they confirmed the executive review office doesn't meet with applicants. Mason laughed. Then we find someone who does. The following morning, Brian began where every corporate attorney would. Public records, the Ohio Secretary of State database, corporate ownership filings, business registrations. He entered one company name after another. Wright Strategic Compliance Group. Nothing unusual appeared. Privately held. Headquartered in Columbus. Established 20 years earlier. No executive biographies. No marketing material. No board photographs. No press releases. Brian frowned. He searched again. Still nothing. Most consulting firms promoted themselves aggressively. Awards. Executive profiles. Conference appearances. This company seemed determined to remain invisible. Rachel walked into his office carrying breakfast. Anything? Brian turned the monitor toward her. Look. She scanned the screen. That's it. That's everything. No executive names? No. No leadership page? No. No media interviews. Brian shook his head. It's almost like they don't want anyone finding them. Rachel quietly replied, maybe they don't. Meanwhile, Jonathan's Friday morning began exactly as expected. He arrived at Wright Strategic Compliance Group at 6:55. Security greeted him by name. The receptionist handed him his schedule. Margaret delivered overnight reports. Nothing suggested anyone across the city was trying to discover who he was. At 8:30, Jonathan met with department managers reviewing annual quality audits. One manager asked, "Should we reduce documentation requirements for repeat clients?" Jonathan answered without hesitation, "No. They've already proven reliable." "They've proven reliable before." The manager nodded slowly. Jonathan continued, "Compliance exists for the day reliable people become distracted." Nobody argued. Everyone in the room understood his philosophy. Rules existed to protect good people from ordinary human mistakes. Not because good people lacked integrity, because everyone eventually overlooked something. That belief had built the company. It remained unchanged. Across town, Mason Caldwell made several phone calls. He contacted executives he had known for years, bank presidents, investment partners, corporate consultants. His influence usually opened doors. This time it didn't. Late Friday afternoon, he called Ellie. "I've got something." "What?" "I found someone who worked with Wright Strategic Compliance." Ellie's attention sharpened. "What did they say?" "They said the company has one of the strictest executive review systems in the country." "So who runs it?" "They don't know." Ellie blinked. "They worked with them." "I know." "And they don't know." "They said approvals always came through internal review. No executive meetings. No. No negotiations. No." Ellie slowly lowered the phone. For perhaps the first time in her career, influence had accomplished absolutely nothing. The following Monday, Brian hired an outside corporate intelligence consultant. Not for anything illegal. Simply to understand the approval structure. The consultant, Eric Donovan, specialized in corporate governance research. He entered Harper Biotechnologies carrying a thin laptop and years of confidence. "I've tracked executive ownership across Fortune 500 companies." Ellie extended her hand. "Can you identify who's approving our contracts?" Eric smiled. "Probably." Brian looked hopeful. "How long?" "Give me 48 hours. Jonathan spent those same 48 hours doing remarkably ordinary things. Tuesday evening, he attended his neighborhood community board meeting. Residents discussed street lighting, park maintenance, traffic calming measures. Jonathan volunteered to help review next year's maintenance budget. Nobody in the room knew he had approved contracts worth nearly $3 billion that month alone. After the meeting, his elderly neighbor, Frank Miller, stopped him outside. "Jonathan?" "Evening, Frank." "You still driving that old Avalon?" Jonathan smiled. "It keeps refusing to brake." Frank laughed. "My grandson says I should buy something electric." "What do you think?" "I think monthly payments aren't nearly as exciting as television commercials make them look." Jonathan laughed. "I couldn't agree more." They spoke another 10 minutes about baseball, retirement, the weather, ordinary conversations, ordinary lives, exactly the way Jonathan preferred. On Wednesday afternoon, Eric Donovan returned to Harper Biotechnologies. His expression looked different, less confident. He placed a folder on the conference table. "I've never seen anything like this." Ellie leaned forward. "What happened?" Eric opened the folder. "Wright Strategic Compliance intentionally separates operational authority." Brian frowned. "What does that mean?" "No single executive appears publicly." Rachel asked, "Then who approves contracts?" Eric pointed toward a flowchart. "Departments review. Legal reviews. Risk reviews. Financial reviews. Regulatory reviews. And then, they enter executive governance. Ellie crossed her arms. Who's there? Eric slowly shook his head. I can't tell. Why not? There are no public records identifying individual executive reviewers. Brian looked surprised. None. None. Mason frowned. That's impossible. Eric calmly replied, It's unusual. He turned another page. The ownership structure consists of multiple holding companies. Rachel studied the diagram. It looks intentional. It is. Someone designed this. Eric nodded. Someone very careful. Brian remained unconvinced. There has to be a signature somewhere. Eric smiled faintly. I thought the same thing. He reached into the folder. I requested copies of several publicly available commercial filings. Ellie leaned closer. What did you find? Most signatures are digital. So, digital signatures still originate somewhere. He placed several documents across the table. Equipment financing, insurance approvals, manufacturing authorizations, commercial licensing. Every document ended differently. Different clients, different industries, different states. Yet one thing appeared identical. A small, handwritten signature. Rachel looked carefully. It says, Brian finished the sentence. N. Wright. Ellie frowned. Nathan. Eric shook his head. Just the initial. Mason shrugged. Could be anyone. Brian wasn't satisfied. There are hundreds of Wrights. Eric nodded. Exactly. But every approval ends with the same signature. Ellie stared silently at the documents. The name meant nothing. Not yet. Later that afternoon, Jonathan reviewed another executive approval package. Harper Biotechnologies again. The corrected cold chain validation had finally arrived. Everything looked complete. He continued reading. Near the end of the file, another issue appeared. A distribution agreement referenced outdated FDA reporting procedures that had been replaced 6 months earlier. Jonathan sighed quietly. Not frustration, disappointment. He reached for the policy manual. Section 14.7. Regulatory references must reflect current federal guidance before execution. Clear, unambiguous. He highlighted the page. Margaret entered. Anything. Jonathan turned the file toward her. Updated FDA reporting language. She read it. They're getting closer. They are. They're making honest corrections. Jonathan nodded. Yes. She hesitated. Would anyone blame you for overlooking this one? Jonathan smiled. Eventually. What do you mean? If the regulation changes again, everyone will wonder why we approved outdated language. Margaret slowly nodded. I hadn't thought of that. That's our job. He selected the familiar template. Updated federal reporting references required before executive authorization. Click Send. Another request entered Harper Biotechnologies' inbox. Brian opened the newest notification just before 5. He stared at it for several seconds before calling Ellie. They found another one. Ellie closed her eyes. What now? Federal reporting language. She almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because she no longer knew how someone could continue finding details no one else noticed. After hanging up, she gathered the stack of returned documents. Nearly every page carried the same routing code, the same approval office, the same unknown reviewer. She spread the papers across her desk, one by one. Then suddenly something caught her attention. Not the routing number, not the compliance request, the signature. Small, neat, almost impossible to notice unless someone deliberately looked for it. Ellie picked up another document, then another, then another. Every final authorization carried the exact same handwriting. Her heartbeat slowed. She whispered almost to herself, "Who are you?" Across Columbus, Jonathan switched off the lights in his office, locked the door, and walked toward the elevator without the slightest idea that somewhere in another building, Ellie had just begun studying the signature that had quietly followed him through thousands of contracts over the past 2 decades. Ellie barely slept that night. The stack of contracts remained spread across the dining table inside her condominium. Every document looked different. Different clients, different industries, different dates, different legal teams. Yet each one ended exactly the same way. A clean executive signature. N. Wright. She poured another cup of coffee shortly after midnight and compared them side by side. The handwriting never changed, not even slightly. The pressure, the angle, the spacing. It belonged to the same person. She looked at the oldest approval. Almost 8 years earlier. The newest one had been signed less than 3 weeks ago. 8 years, one signature, one invisible executive. She whispered to herself, "Who hides for 8 years?" The following morning, Brian Foster arrived carrying another folder. Ellie immediately slid the contracts across the conference table. "I need everything you can find." Brian adjusted his glasses. "About what?" "The signature." He examined the pages. "I noticed it. I want to know who N. Wright is." Brian nodded slowly. "I've already started." Rachel Simmons entered moments later. "You two look like neither of you slept." Ellie pointed toward the documents. "We're finding the executive." Rachel looked down. "N. Wright." "Exactly." Rachel sat quietly. "If they're willing to stay invisible for this long—" She stopped herself. Ellie looked up. "What?" "They probably planned it." Brian agreed. "This isn't accidental." By noon, Brian had submitted formal requests through several commercial databases: executive registrations, professional licenses, corporate governance filings, industry compliance records. Most searches returned dozens of people named Wright. None connected directly to Wright Strategic Compliance Group. Until one result appeared. Executive Governance Authorization Registry. Authorized Executive Signatory. Jonathan A. Wright. Brian stared at the screen. He blinked twice, then searched again. The same result appeared. Jonathan Andrew Wright, Columbus, Ohio, Executive Governance Authority, Wright Strategic Compliance Group. He frowned. "No." He clicked deeper. The registration required authenticated access. Only limited public information appeared. Still, the name remained. Jonathan Wright. Brian leaned back. His first reaction wasn't certainty. It was disbelief. There had to be another Jonathan Wright. The name wasn't uncommon. He opened another database. Corporate Tax Registration. The same name. Commercial Authorization Registry. The same name. Federal Compliance Executive Certification. Again. Jonathan Andrew Wright. Brian's heartbeat accelerated. He immediately called Rachel. "I need you in my office." Rachel arrived carrying her tablet. "What happened?" Brian turned the monitor. She read the name, then looked back at him. "Jonathan?" He nodded slowly. "There can't be many executive governance officers with that exact name." Rachel remained silent. Images began replaying inside her mind. Jonathan quietly attending company holiday dinners. Jonathan helping Ellie carry presentation materials into conferences. Jonathan sitting alone in the corner while investors surrounded Ellie. Jonathan always listening, never interrupting. She whispered, "You think it's him?" Brian rubbed his forehead. "I don't know. But I think we need proof." Ellie refused to believe it. When Brian entered her office, she looked up without smiling. "You found him?" "I found a name." "Who?" Brian hesitated. "I'm not certain." "Tell me." He placed the printed registry on her desk. She looked down, then laughed once. A short, nervous laugh. "No." Brian said nothing. She looked again. Jonathan Andrew Wright. Executive Governance Authority. Wright Strategic Compliance Group. No. She pushed the paper away. This is a coincidence. Rachel quietly entered. Brian looked toward her. Tell her. Rachel spoke carefully. We don't know yet. Ellie stood. My ex-husband reviewed supplier contracts. He managed commercial agreements. He drove a 9-year-old Toyota. He packed sandwiches for lunch. Rachel remained calm. All of those things can be true. Ellie shook her head. No. Brian answered gently. I thought the same thing. She paced across the office. Jonathan never mentioned owning a company. Brian quietly replied, Did you ever ask? She stopped walking. For a moment she didn't answer, because the honest answer was uncomfortable. No, she had never asked very much about Jonathan's work. She knew he handled contracts. She knew he liked routine. She knew he disliked attention. Everything else had seemed unimportant. Until now? Brian continued investigating. He requested archived commercial filings dating back 15 years. Hours later, several certified copies arrived. One by one, he opened them. Medical distribution agreements, regional banking partnerships, hospital acquisitions, national insurance programs. Every document contained one final executive signature, Jonathan A. Wright. Not N. Wright, not another Wright. Jonathan Andrew Wright. The same signature. Again, and again, and again. Brian slowly organized them into chronological order. The earliest document had been signed nearly 19 years earlier, long before Ellie founded Harper Biotechnologies, long before she ever believed Jonathan lacked ambition, long before she even met him. Rachel stared silently. My God. Brian nodded. He built this before they got married. Ellie sat alone after everyone left. She opened old photographs stored inside her phone. Jonathan fixing a shelf in the garage. Jonathan mowing the lawn. Jonathan reading contracts at the kitchen table while she prepared investor presentations. Jonathan quietly repairing the backyard fence. Jonathan standing patiently in the audience during one of her award ceremonies. Always smiling. Always in the background. Always ordinary. Or so she had believed. Her memory suddenly returned to countless conversations she had dismissed. One evening, years earlier, she had asked why he never attended business conferences. Jonathan had smiled. I've never needed people to know my face. She had laughed. Now the sentence sounded completely different. Another memory surfaced. She once teased him about receiving work emails late at night. He had answered casually. Some approvals can't wait until morning. She had assumed he meant ordinary office paperwork. She closed her eyes. How many times had the truth been sitting directly in front of her? The next morning, Mason Caldwell arrived expecting progress. Instead, he found silence. Ellie slid the certified registry across the conference table. He read it, then frowned. This can't be right, Brian answered. I've verified it 3 different ways. Mason looked again. Jonathan Wright? Yes. Your ex-husband? Ellie nodded without speaking. Mason laughed in disbelief. No. Brian opened another folder. These are archived approvals. Mason flipped through them. The same signature appeared repeatedly. Different years, different industries, different clients. Thousands of pages. One executive. His smile disappeared. When did he start this company? Brian answered quietly. Approximately 20 years ago. Mason slowly lowered the folder. 20 years. Rachel looked toward Ellie. He never told anyone. Mason corrected her. No. He looked carefully at Jonathan's name printed across the certified registry. He never needed to. The room remained silent for nearly a full minute. Finally, Ellie spoke, barely above a whisper. Every contract. Brian nodded. Yes. The bank? Yes. The manufacturers? Yes. The insurance approvals? Yes. She swallowed hard. And ours? Brian looked directly into her eyes. Eventually, he paused, every one of them lands on Jonathan Wright's desk. No one spoke after that. The realization settled over the room with a weight that words could no longer describe. Ellie had spent years believing Jonathan lived inside the shadow of her success. Now she understood something far more unsettling. She had been standing in the shadow of his influence without ever recognizing it. And for the first time since signing the divorce papers, she realized there was only one person who could answer the questions haunting her, Jonathan. Ellie left the office before anyone could stop her. She ignored Rachel calling her name from the hallway, ignored 3 incoming calls from Mason, ignored the growing list of unread emails lighting up her phone. For the first time in years, she was not thinking about investors' production schedules or expansion forecasts. She was thinking about one question. Who had Jonathan really been? Not the man she divorced. Not the quiet husband who cooked dinner every Tuesday. Not the patient listener who never interrupted her stories about board meetings. The other Jonathan. The one who had quietly built an entire company that operated behind the scenes of corporate America. The one whose signature now sat at the end of every path she needed to follow. Brian insisted on coming with her. "So does Rebecca Lawson," he said as they entered the parking garage. Ellie looked confused. "Jonathan's divorce attorney." Brian nodded. "I called her." "You did what?" "I thought she deserved to know we intended to meet Jonathan professionally." Ellie frowned. "Why?" "Because this is no longer personal." She looked at him. "It feels personal." Brian shook his head. "That's exactly why Rebecca should be there." Ellie didn't argue. Deep down, she knew he was right. If emotions entered the room, someone needed to keep the conversation grounded in facts. 25 minutes later, they stood inside the lobby of Wright Strategic Compliance Group. The building looked nothing like Ellie expected. She had imagined luxury, oversized logos, marble floors, a corporate monument built to impress clients. Instead, she found something surprisingly restrained. Natural stone, warm lighting, quiet conversations, employees moving with calm efficiency. Nobody rushed. Nobody appeared stressed. The receptionist smiled politely. "Good afternoon." Brian stepped forward. "We'd like to speak with Jonathan Wright." The receptionist asked calmly, "Do you have an appointment?" "No." "I'm sorry." Her tone remained friendly. "Mr. Wright meets by appointment only." Ellie spoke for the first time. "Please tell him Ellie Harper is here." The receptionist typed something into her computer. A few seconds passed. Then she looked up. "One moment." She disappeared through a secure door. Ellie looked around the lobby. Every employee she could see appeared focused. No raised voices. No executives giving dramatic instructions. No expensive displays celebrating success. Everything reflected discipline rather than prestige. She suddenly remembered Jonathan once telling her, "A good system should never need to prove it's organized." She had barely listened. 3 minutes later, the receptionist returned. "Mr. Wright will see you." No surprise, no hesitation, only those 5 words. She guided them toward a private elevator. As the doors closed, Ellie noticed Brian quietly adjusting his tie. "Nervous?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "I've argued before federal judges. And I've never met the person who's been correcting all my contracts." The elevator opened onto the executive floor. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Columbus. The offices were elegant without being extravagant. Glass, wood, steel, everything had purpose. Nothing existed simply for appearance. Employees greeted Jonathan as they passed. Not because he was watching, because it was normal. Ellie noticed something else. People smiled naturally. Not the forced smiles executives often received. The relaxed smiles reserved for someone respected. A woman in her 60s approached. "Good afternoon, Rebecca." Rebecca Lawson smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Margaret." Margaret Ellis. Ellie recognized the name from several compliance notices. Margaret looked toward Ellie. "You must be Miss Harper." Ellie nodded. Margaret extended her hand. "Welcome." There was no sarcasm, no judgment, only professionalism. Ellie found that strangely unsettling. She almost wished someone would be hostile. Instead, everyone behaved as though this meeting were simply another part of the day. Jonathan's office door stood open. He was reading a contract when they arrived. He looked up, smiled politely. "Ellie." His voice sounded exactly the same as it always had. Calm, measured, neither cold nor warm, just steady. He stood. "Brian?" They shook hands. "Rebecca." Rebecca smiled. "Good afternoon, Jonathan." He gestured toward the conference table inside his office. "Please." Everyone sat. Jonathan poured water into 4 glasses before taking his own seat. No assistant entered. No security remained nearby. No dramatic display of authority. Just 4 people sitting around a table. Ellie studied the office. The shelves held law books, regulatory manuals, industry journals. Only one personal photograph rested on the bookshelf. Jonathan standing beside his father. She had seen that picture years earlier, inside their home. He had brought it with him after the divorce. Jonathan folded his hands. "What can I help you with?" Ellie answered immediately. "Why?" He looked at her calmly. "I'm not sure which question you're asking." "You know exactly what I mean," Rebecca gently interrupted. "Ellie." Brian quietly nodded toward her. Ellie took a slow breath. She started again. "We've learned that our contracts are being reviewed here." "Yes." "And they're reaching your desk." Jonathan nodded once. "They are." She stared at him. "You never told me." Jonathan answered honestly. "You never asked." The room became silent, not because the answer was cruel, because it was true. Ellie searched for another response. None came. Brian opened one of the binders. "We're trying to understand the review process." Jonathan nodded. "I can explain the process." He stood and walked toward a large display screen mounted on the wall. One touch illuminated a workflow diagram: initial legal review, financial verification, risk assessment, regulatory compliance, insurance validation, executive governance. Jonathan pointed toward each stage. "No contract reaches executive governance unless every previous department completes its review." Brian studied the diagram. "So by the time something reaches you, multiple specialists have already examined it." "And your responsibility," Jonathan answered simply, "to verify the integrity of the entire process." Ellie finally spoke. "Then why do our contracts keep coming back?" Jonathan looked directly at her. "They're incomplete." She frowned. "Every time. Every time." Brian leaned forward. "Can you show us?" Jonathan nodded. "Of course." He opened Harper Biotechnology's digital file. Every submission appeared on the screen, every revision, every request, every response. Nothing had been deleted. Nothing had been hidden. He selected the first returned document: supplier certification, highlighted in yellow, expiration date, supporting regulation attached beside it. He opened the second: insurance endorsement, required language highlighted, corresponding state regulation attached. Third, cold chain validation, federal guidance cited. Fourth, updated FDA reporting requirements. Again, every request connected directly to published regulations. Jonathan clicked through them one after another. No opinions, no personal notes, No emotional comments. Only evidence. Brian slowly removed his glasses. He already knew what he would find. Still, seeing the complete file was overwhelming. Every request had legal authority. Every correction had documentation. Every decision had supporting evidence. There wasn't a single arbitrary action. Ellie looked up. "So you weren't trying to stop us?" Jonathan answered immediately. "No." "Then why didn't you approve something anyway?" He looked almost puzzled by the question. "Because it wasn't ready." "It was close." Jonathan nodded. "It was." She leaned forward. Would anyone really have noticed one missing regulation? Jonathan met her eyes. "Eventually." She remembered hearing him use that word before. "Eventually?" He stood and picked up another contract from his desk. "This agreement." He placed it between them. "If I approve it today with outdated regulatory language." He turned one page. "And 6 months from now, your company becomes involved in litigation." Another page. "Every attorney will ask why the outdated language remained." Another page. "Every insurer will review the approval." He tapped the final signature line. "And eventually," his finger rested beside the space where he would sign, "someone will ask why Jonathan Wright approved something that wasn't complete." Silence returned. Ellie looked at the blank signature line. For the first time, she understood what his signature actually meant. It wasn't permission. It was accountability. Jonathan sat back down. "I don't sign because people trust me." He spoke quietly. "I sign because one day someone may stop trusting me." Brian lowered his eyes. He had practiced law for nearly 2 decades, yet he had rarely heard responsibility described so simply. Rebecca smiled, almost imperceptibly. Jonathan hadn't changed, not even a little. Ellie looked around the office once more. Nothing about it reflected ego. No awards, no magazine covers, no framed interviews, only systems, records, evidence. The realization hurt more than any argument ever could. She had spent years believing Jonathan lacked ambition. In truth, he had simply chosen to build something so strong that it no longer depended on anyone knowing his name. When the meeting ended, nobody stood immediately. The room remained unusually quiet. Ellie looked down at the open compliance file still resting on the conference table. For nearly an hour, Jonathan had answered every question with documents instead of opinions. Every accusation had been met with evidence. Every doubt had been answered by regulations. She realized something uncomfortable. Not once had Jonathan defended himself. He had only explained the process. There was a difference. Rebecca Lawson finally closed her notebook. "I believe we've covered everything." Brian slowly nodded. "I think we have." Ellie remained silent. Jonathan stood first. "If additional documentation is submitted, the review will continue through the normal process." She looked up. "No special treatment." Jonathan smiled politely. "No." "No penalty?" "No." "No advantage?" Again the same calm answer. "No?" She studied him for several seconds. "You really mean that?" "I do." Rebecca looked toward Ellie. "The rules protect everyone," Jonathan added quietly, "especially the people enforcing them." Outside the building, none of them spoke during the elevator ride. The silence continued across the lobby. Only after reaching the parking garage did Brian finally stop walking. "I owe him an apology." Rachel looked at him. "For what?" Brian exhaled slowly. "I spent weeks assuming someone was trying to sabotage us." He looked back toward the building. He wasn't. Mason Caldwell had arrived just minutes earlier and was waiting beside his black SUV. The moment he saw them, he walked over. "Well," Ellie didn't answer. Mason looked toward Brian. "What happened?" Brian spoke plainly. "They're right." Mason frowned. "What do you mean they're right?" "I mean every compliance request." He paused. "Every single one." Mason laughed dismissively. Come on. Brian shook his head. I reviewed the evidence myself. There has to be discretion. There is. So, they exercised it correctly. Mason's expression hardened. I don't believe that. Brian quietly replied, You don't have to. The documents already do. That afternoon, Mason contacted an outside auditing firm based in Chicago. If Jonathan's company insisted Harper Biotechnologies had deficiencies, Mason wanted independent confirmation. 3 auditors arrived 2 days later. They spent nearly 36 hours reviewing every contract involved in the expansion. Supplier agreements, manufacturing partnerships, insurance policies, federal registrations, distribution contracts. When they finished, they requested a meeting. Ellie sat across from the lead auditor, Karen Mitchell. Karen placed a thick report on the conference table. You requested an independent review. Yes. Karen opened the report. Our findings are complete. Ellie leaned forward. And, Karen looked directly at her, Wright Strategic Compliance applied the correct standards. Ellie's shoulders lowered slightly. Karen continued. We independently identified 93% of the same deficiencies. Brian slowly closed his eyes. Mason interrupted. What about the remaining 7%? Karen turned several pages. Our reviewers actually identified 4 additional issues that had not yet reached executive review. The room became completely silent. Rachel looked at Brian. Brian looked at the report. No one spoke. Karen folded her hands. Your company isn't being treated unfairly. She paused. Your company is being reviewed thoroughly. News of the independent audit spread quietly among Harper Biotechnologies investors. No scandal emerged, no fraud, no misconduct. Instead, something more damaging happened. Confidence weakened. During the next investor conference call, several questions sounded different than before. One investor asked, how did internal legal miss these issues? Another asked, what quality control procedures currently exist? A third simply asked, how many additional corrections should we expect? Ellie answered every question honestly. We're implementing stronger review procedures. The investors appreciated her honesty. They remained cautious. Later that evening, Rachel found Ellie sitting alone in the laboratory break room. 2 untouched cups of coffee rested on the table. Rachel quietly sat beside her. You haven't gone home. Ellie shook her head. I keep thinking. About Jonathan. Ellie nodded. I spent years believing confidence looked like Mason. Rachel smiled faintly. And now, Ellie stared through the window into the production floor. Now I think confidence might look like someone who never needs to raise his voice. Rachel remained quiet. Ellie continued. Do you know what bothered me most? What? He never once reminded me that he was right. Rachel understood immediately, because Jonathan hadn't needed to. The documentation had done it for him. Across Columbus, Jonathan's week continued almost exactly as before. Tuesday morning, executive review meeting. Wednesday, healthcare acquisition approvals. Thursday, regulatory policy updates. Friday, internal governance training. Nothing about Harper Biotechnologies occupied more attention than any other client. Margaret Ellis noticed. She stepped into Jonathan's office Friday afternoon, carrying quarterly performance reports. Interesting week. Jonathan looked up. In what way? Several clients have complimented the consistency of our executive reviews. He smiled politely. That's good. Margaret hesitated. And Harper Biotechnologies. Jonathan returned his attention to another contract. What about them? They completed another round of corrections. Excellent. They're improving quickly. Jonathan nodded once. They are. Margaret leaned against the doorway. Can I ask something? Of course. Did meeting Ellie make things awkward? Jonathan considered the question carefully. A little. How did you handle it? The same way I handle every meeting. She smiled. I suppose you did? Jonathan glanced toward the framed photograph of his father. My father used to tell me something. Margaret waited. He said people eventually become exactly who they practice being. She nodded thoughtfully. So, if you practice fairness becomes easier than favoritism. Margaret smiled. I like that. Jonathan returned to reading. So did he. Meanwhile, Brian Foster gathered every attorney in Harper Biotechnology's legal department. Stacks of contracts covered the conference table. He looked around the room. We're changing how we work. One junior attorney asked, What happened? Brian answered honestly. We became too comfortable relying on speed. Another attorney asked, Is this because of Wright strategic compliance? Brian nodded. In part. He walked towards the whiteboard. Starting today, every agreement receives 3 independent reviews before leaving this department. Someone quietly muttered, That's going to take longer. Brian looked toward the speaker. It will, he paused, but it will also make us better. No one argued. Not after seeing the audit report, Mason Caldwell remained unconvinced. He visited Ellie late Friday afternoon. This company is losing momentum. Ellie looked up from another compliance checklist. It's gaining discipline. Mason frowned. Discipline doesn't impress venture capital. Ellie calmly replied, Neither do preventable lawsuits. He stared at her. You've changed. She smiled slightly. No. She looked down at Jonathan's latest compliance notes. I think I'm finally catching up. Mason left without another word. Rachel watched him walk away through the office windows. He won't stay. Ellie nodded. I know. Does that worry you? Ellie looked across the production floor, where employees carefully inspected equipment instead of rushing toward deadlines. She thought about Jonathan's office. The quiet, the order, the evidence. Finally, she answered. It used to. She picked up the next contract. It doesn't anymore. At that exact moment across town, Jonathan signed another routine executive approval for a hospital expansion in Indiana. No celebration followed, no announcement. Only another completed responsibility. He placed the signed contract into the outgoing tray before reaching for the next file. Halfway through the stack, one familiar company name appeared once again. Harper Biotechnologies. Jonathan opened the revised documents. For the first time since the expansion began, he read through page after page without marking a single correction. He continued carefully. Every clause, every certification, every disclosure, everything appeared stronger than before. Then he reached the final section. His eyes paused on one newly added governance policy. He smiled, almost imperceptibly. Someone inside Harper Biotechnologies had begun thinking differently. He closed the folder gently. One final review remained. If everything held together, the signature Ellie had spent weeks chasing was finally getting closer than ever before. The first sign of change did not come from the contracts. It came from people. Within 2 weeks of implementing Brian Foster's new legal review procedures, mistakes that once slipped through unnoticed were being caught before documents ever left Harper Biotechnologies. One supplier agreement contained conflicting indemnity language. A junior attorney found it. An insurance amendment referenced outdated state regulations. Rachel identified it herself. A manufacturing vendor submitted incomplete quality certifications. The procurement team rejected the package before legal ever saw it. For the first time since the expansion began, Harper Biotechnologies stopped reacting to problems. It started preventing them. Brian noticed the difference immediately. He walked into Ellie's office carrying a much thinner stack of folders than usual. We're getting better. Ellie looked up. How much better? Brian smiled. I haven't returned a contract to another department in 4 days. She leaned back in her chair. A month ago, that would have been impossible. It would have. He placed the folders on her desk. The team isn't rushing anymore. Ellie nodded thoughtfully. Neither am I. The next executive submission reached Wright Strategic Compliance Group on a quiet Monday morning. Margaret Ellis carried the file into Jonathan's office. Harper again? Jonathan accepted the folder. Thank you. Margaret remained standing. I already reviewed it. And, she smiled, I couldn't find anything. Jonathan opened the first page. Let's see. For nearly 25 minutes, he read every section. The room remained completely silent. Margaret watched him work. She had seen this routine thousands of times. Jonathan never skimmed, never assumed. Every page received the same careful attention regardless of whether the client was a local manufacturer or a Fortune 100 corporation. Page after page passed. No notes, no highlights, no correction requests. Finally, Jonathan reached the final certification. He compared it against the supporting documentation. Everything matched. He closed the file. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Well, Jonathan smiled faintly. They've done excellent work. Margaret looked genuinely pleased. I thought you might say that. He nodded once. The improvement is significant. She laughed softly. I imagine they're relieved. Jonathan quietly replied, I imagine they've earned it. Point and tons. Across town, Harper Biotechnologies waited. Every employee understood that another decision was approaching. No one said it aloud, but everyone checked their email more often than usual. Rachel walked through the operations department. People looked busy, focused, different. Not because they feared another rejection, because they no longer wanted one. Ellie noticed the same thing. The culture inside the company had shifted. Meetings became shorter. Preparation became deeper. Questions became more specific. Instead of asking, how quickly can we finish this? People now asked, what are we missing? She recognized the change immediately. It sounded remarkably familiar. It sounded like Jonathan. At Wright Strategic Compliance Group, Jonathan scheduled one final internal review before signing. Robert Kim entered carrying a legal verification checklist. You wanted another review? Jonathan nodded. Yes. Robert smiled. I couldn't find anything. Good. Margaret joined them. Neither could regulatory. Jonathan looked toward Robert. Insurance. Complete. Financial. Approved. Environmental. Verified. Jonathan folded his hands. Then let's review it together. Robert laughed. You're serious? Jonathan smiled. I usually am. The three of them spent another 40 minutes examining the package, not because they expected problems, because important decisions deserved patience. When they finished, Robert closed the final binder. I think this is one of the cleanest submissions we've received all quarter, Margaret agreed. They've clearly changed their process. Jonathan nodded quietly. Yes, Robert looked at him. Do you think your meeting with Ellie influenced that? Jonathan answered after a brief pause. I hope the evidence did. That afternoon, Brian received an unexpected phone call. The caller identified herself as Margaret Ellis. Brian immediately sat straighter. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Foster. Brian reached for a pen. I'm ready. Margaret smiled on the other end of the line. You don't need one. He looked surprised. I don't. No additional documentation is being requested. Brian froze. For a full second, he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. I'm sorry, Margaret repeated herself. The executive review process has been completed. Brian slowly stood from his chair. So, he couldn't finish the sentence. Margaret answered it anyway. The file is moving to final authorization. Brian thanked her before ending the call. He remained standing in silence. Rachel entered moments later. You look like you've seen a ghost. Brian looked toward her. It's happening. What is? They're sending it to final authorization. Rachel smiled. No corrections? None. Her shoulders relaxed for the first time in weeks. I'll tell Ellie. Brian gently stopped her. No. She looked confused. Why not? I want her to hear it herself. Ellie was reviewing quarterly hiring projections when Brian knocked. Come in. He entered carrying only a single sheet of paper. She immediately noticed the difference. No thick binders, no highlighted corrections, no compliance requests, only one page. What is it? Brian handed it to her. She read the first sentence. Executive review complete. No additional compliance requirements. The words blurred for a moment. She read them again, then a third time. Finally, she looked up. They approved everything, Brian smiled. They approved the review. She frowned slightly. There's a difference. One final signature remains. Ellie slowly nodded. Jonathan. His name wasn't written anywhere on the document. It didn't have to be. She knew whose desk the file would reach. Meanwhile, Jonathan stood alone in his office, overlooking the river. The Harper Biotechnologies file rested in the center of his desk. Beside it lay 3 unrelated contracts awaiting signatures. He deliberately ignored all 4 for several minutes. Instead, he walked to the window. His father used to insist on taking one final pause before making important decisions. Never sign while you're still thinking, he would say. Sign after you've finished thinking. Jonathan had adopted the habit decades earlier. He returned to his desk, sat down, opened the file once more. Every page remained exactly as he remembered. Complete, accurate, responsible. He picked up his pen, then paused again. Not because he doubted the documents, because signatures deserved one final moment of respect. Later that evening, Columbus hosted its annual Chamber of Commerce dinner. Ellie attended reluctantly. She had ignored several invitations over the previous month. Tonight, she finally accepted. Not because she wanted publicity, because Rachel insisted the company should begin reconnecting with business leaders. As Ellie entered the ballroom, conversations gradually shifted. People greeted her warmly. Something felt different. There was less admiration, more respect. A regional hospital executive approached first. I heard you completely overhauled your governance process. Ellie smiled. We did. Smart decision. Another CEO joined them. My legal department heard excellent things. About what? The way your company responded to compliance. Ellie looked surprised. You heard about that, he nodded. The business community notices integrity. For the first time, Ellie understood something Jonathan had known for years. Reputation traveled quietly. Far more quietly than publicity. Across the ballroom, she noticed another familiar face. Brian. He was speaking with several corporate attorneys. As she approached, one of them smiled. You must be Ellie. She nodded. I've wanted to congratulate your team. For what? He laughed softly. Surviving Wright strategic compliance. Everyone smiled. Not mockingly, respectfully. The attorney continued. Very few companies complain after working with them. Why? Because eventually everyone realizes the same thing. Ellie waited. They don't make companies weaker. He raised his glass slightly. They make them harder to break. Ellie stood quietly absorbing the words. Across town, in a dark office overlooking the city, Jonathan turned off his desk lamp. The Harper Biotechnologies file remained exactly where he had left it, unsigned. Not because he had found another problem, Because one signature that carried billions of dollars in responsibility would never be rushed even by a single day. The next morning arrived clear and unusually warm for late October. Jonathan reached his office before sunrise. The executive floor remained almost silent. Only the soft hum of computers and the distant sound of elevators interrupted the quiet. Sarah, the receptionist, looked up with a smile. "Good morning, Mr. Wright." "Morning, Sarah. You have one personal appointment today." Jonathan paused. "I do." She nodded. 1 o'clock. He glanced at his schedule. There it was. Private lunch, requested by Ellie Harper. Jonathan stood still for a moment. Not because he was surprised, because he had expected the request eventually. "Thank you." "I booked the restaurant you requested." He smiled politely. "I appreciate it." The restaurant overlooked the Scioto River, tucked away several blocks from downtown. It was the same place Jonathan had occasionally visited during long workdays years before. Quiet. No televisions. No loud music, no photographers. A place where conversations mattered more than appearances. Jonathan arrived 10 minutes early, as always. He ordered iced tea, nothing else. At exactly 1 o'clock, Ellie walked through the front door. She looked different. Not physically. Calmer. The constant urgency that had defined her for the past several years seemed to have faded. She spotted Jonathan immediately. He stood as she approached. "Thank you for coming." She nodded. "Thank you for agreeing." Neither reached across the table. Neither attempted a hug. The distance between them no longer felt hostile. It simply felt honest. For several minutes, they discussed ordinary things. The weather, traffic, the restaurant's new menu. Neither rushed toward the real conversation. Finally, Ellie placed her hands around her coffee cup. "I've replayed our marriage 100 times over the last few weeks." Jonathan remained quiet. "I keep wondering how I missed it." He looked at her gently. "Missed what?" "You." He smiled faintly. "You knew me." She slowly shook her head. "I knew the version of you I bothered to notice." The sentence lingered between them. Jonathan didn't interrupt. Ellie continued. "I knew what car you drove." She smiled sadly. "I knew you packed your lunch every morning. I knew you hated wasting money. I knew you liked baseball." She looked directly into his eyes. "But I never really knew what you spent your life building," Jonathan answered softly. "You never asked." She nodded. "I know." There was no defensiveness left in her voice, only regret. The waiter arrived. They ordered lunch. When he left, Ellie spoke again. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jonathan leaned back thoughtfully. "I've asked myself that question. And I don't think I ever had a good reason to." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I never hid my work." She looked surprised. "You never talked about it." "I answered whenever someone asked." "You never volunteered." Jonathan smiled. "I don't volunteer information because I own a company." She looked puzzled. "Why not?" He glanced toward the river outside. "When I was young," he paused, "I thought success meant being recognized. And then, I met people who were recognized for things they hadn't actually built." He smiled quietly. "I also met people who built extraordinary things that almost nobody knew about." Ellie listened carefully. "They seemed happier." "Happier." "They slept well." He laughed softly. "They weren't performing success. They were simply working." Ellie remembered Mason Caldwell. The expensive watches, the interviews, the magazine covers. She remembered Jonathan, the Toyota, the packed lunches, the quiet evenings. For years, she had assumed one represented success and the other represented settling. Now she wasn't so certain. Jonathan stirred his iced tea. "My father repaired bridges." Ellie smiled. I remember. He never cared whether people knew his name. I remember that too. Jonathan nodded. He used to say something. What? If a bridge stands for 50 years, nobody asks who built it. Ellie waited. If it collapses tomorrow, everyone does. She lowered her eyes. So you built your company the same way. I tried. No attention. No unnecessary attention. No interviews. No conferences. No magazine profiles. Jonathan shrugged gently. I wanted our clients remembering the strength of the contracts, not the people signing them. Their meals arrived. For several minutes they ate quietly. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt familiar, almost peaceful. Ellie finally broke it. I said you were holding me back. Jonathan nodded once. You did? I believed it. I know. She swallowed. I was wrong. Jonathan looked at her calmly. I think you believed what you saw. She frowned. What does that mean? You saw someone living simply. Yes. You assumed simplicity meant small ambitions. She looked away. It did to me. Jonathan smiled. It used to mean that to me too. She looked back. What changed? He answered without hesitation. I realized complicated lives and meaningful lives aren't the same thing. Ellie laughed quietly. I spent years trying to look successful. Jonathan smiled. You were successful. I know. She shook her head. But I also spent years trying to look successful. He didn't disagree, because he couldn't. It was true. She reached into her bag and removed an old photograph. Jonathan recognized it immediately. Their first apartment, 20 years earlier. Both of them standing beside mismatched furniture. Neither owned much, neither cared. Ellie smiled. You remember this? I do. You worked until midnight every night? Jonathan nodded. You were studying for executive certifications. I was. I thought you were chasing promotions. Jonathan smiled. I was chasing knowledge. She stared at the photograph. I never asked what those certifications were. No. I should have. You could have. The honesty stung, not because Jonathan intended it to, because it was simply true. Ellie looked out toward the river. I've spent the last month apologizing to people inside my company. Jonathan listened. I apologized to Brian. I apologized to Rachel. I apologized to employees for pushing speed instead of quality. She hesitated. I still haven't apologized to you. Jonathan remained quiet. She finally looked directly at him. I'm sorry. The words carried none of the desperation she had expected, only sincerity. Jonathan smiled gently. I know. No. She shook her head. I need you to hear all of it. He waited. I'm sorry I judged your worth by what everyone else could see. She paused. I'm sorry I confused attention with importance. Another pause. And I'm sorry I stopped asking about your life because I assumed I already knew it. Jonathan looked at her for several seconds, then quietly replied, Thank you. Nothing more. No speech, no lecture, no attempt to make the moment larger than it needed to be. His acceptance somehow made the apology feel even heavier. Ellie hesitated before asking the question she had carried with her since discovering the truth. If I hadn't needed those contracts, Jonathan looked up. Would you have ever told me? He considered the question honestly. Finally, he answered. I don't know. You really don't? No. She looked surprised. Why? Because I never wanted my work to become the reason someone valued me. She stared at him. I wanted people to value me before they knew what I had built. The simplicity of the answer took her breath away. For years, she had believed Jonathan lacked ambition. Now she understood. He had simply placed his ambition somewhere no applause could reach. The lunch lasted another half hour. When the check arrived, Jonathan reached for it. Ellie smiled. "You always did that?" Jonathan smiled back. "You usually argued." "I don't feel like arguing today." He paid the bill. They walked outside together. The autumn air felt cool against the river. After several steps, Ellie stopped. "I need to ask one more thing." Jonathan turned. "What is it?" She took a slow breath. "Is there any chance—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Jonathan understood anyway. He answered kindly. "I don't think so." She closed her eyes briefly. "I understand. I don't regret our years together." He spoke gently. "But trust doesn't usually disappear in one moment." She nodded. "And it doesn't come back in one either." "No." For the first time since their divorce, they both smiled at the same moment. Not because everything had been repaired, because both of them finally accepted that some chapters were meant to teach rather than continue. As Jonathan walked back toward his office, Ellie remained beside the river for several minutes. She watched him disappear into the afternoon crowd. For years she had believed she had walked away from an ordinary man. Now she understood she had walked away from someone extraordinary, not because of the company he built, but because he had never needed anyone to know he had built it. The Monday after their lunch by the River Harper, Biotechnologies felt like a different company, not because new investors had arrived, not because revenue had suddenly increased. The difference could not be measured on a balance sheet. It could be seen in conference rooms, heard during meetings, felt in the way people paused before saying, "This should be good enough." Those words slowly disappeared. They were replaced by another question. "Can we verify it one more time?" Ellie noticed the change immediately. She stood outside the legal department one morning watching Brian Foster review a supplier agreement with 2 junior attorneys. No one seemed rushed. One attorney pointed toward a paragraph. "The insurance reference doesn't match the updated manufacturing schedule." Brian nodded. "Good catch." Another attorney added, "The indemnification language also needs to reflect Pennsylvania law." Brian smiled. "Let's correct both before compliance ever sees them." Ellie quietly walked away. A month earlier, those issues would have reached Jonathan's office. Now they never would. She realized Jonathan had influenced her company without ever working there. Rachel Simmons entered Ellie's office carrying the latest performance reports. "You should see this." Ellie looked up. "What happened?" Rachel handed her several charts. "Our legal revision rate has dropped by 68%. Ellie examined the numbers. "And procurement. Supplier documentation is now 99% complete before legal review." "What about manufacturing?" Rachel smiled. "Equipment vendors have started asking why we're requesting so much documentation." Ellie laughed softly. "What do we tell them?" Rachel answered with a grin. "We tell them we'd rather ask today than explain tomorrow." Ellie looked at the reports again. For years, she believed discipline slowed progress. Now she could see the opposite. Preparation created speed, just not immediately. Across Columbus, Jonathan reviewed another quarterly governance report. Margaret Ellis placed a summary on his desk. "Our overall correction requests have decreased." Jonathan nodded. "Across all clients." "Most of them." She pointed toward one graph. "Harper Biotechnologies improved the most." Jonathan looked at the figures. The improvement was undeniable. Documentation accuracy, internal legal consistency, regulatory compliance, everything had strengthened. Margaret smiled. "I think they learned." Jonathan quietly replied, "I think they chose to." She noticed the distinction. Learning happened naturally. Choosing required humility. That afternoon, Brian submitted another expansion package. New manufacturing agreements, updated banking documentation, additional insurance endorsements. Everything had already been reviewed internally 4 separate times. Before clicking submit, he looked around his department. No assumptions. Everyone nodded. One attorney answered no shortcuts. Brian smiled. Good. He pressed send. For the first time in weeks, no one felt nervous. Only confident. Not because they expected special treatment, because they trusted their work. The file reached Jonathan's office the following morning. He opened it with the same calm expression he always wore. Client name: Harper Biotechnologies. Review status: Executive authorization. He began reading. Every section reflected careful preparation. Supporting documentation appeared exactly where expected. Cross-references matched perfectly. Insurance certificates remained current. Supplier certifications extended beyond execution dates. Environmental reports aligned with state regulations. Jonathan continued, page after page. Still nothing. Margaret knocked lightly. Busy? Jonathan looked up. Come in. She noticed the Harper file immediately. Another review? Yes. How does it look? Jonathan closed one section before answering. They've built a much stronger process. Margaret smiled. You sound pleased. I'm pleased for them. She sat across from him. I've been wondering something. What? Do you think they changed because of the delays? Jonathan thought for a moment. No. I think they changed because they finally understood why the delays existed. Margaret slowly nodded. There is a difference. A very important one. Meanwhile, Mason Caldwell's patience finally ended. He requested another meeting with Ellie. They met inside the executive conference room late Wednesday afternoon. Mason closed the door behind him. We need to talk. Ellie folded her hands. About what? Growth. We're growing. Not fast enough. She looked at him calmly. We're growing correctly. Mason sighed. Investors don't celebrate caution. Ellie smiled slightly. They celebrate sustainable returns. He leaned forward. You've become too conservative. She didn't react. Instead, she opened a folder. Inside were 3 reports: compliance improvements, reduced legal risk, lower insurance premiums. She slid them across the table. Our insurance costs dropped 11%. Our legal review expenses decreased. Our manufacturing partners report fewer delays. She looked directly at him. Preparation is profitable. Mason barely glanced at the papers. You're thinking like a lawyer. Ellie quietly answered no. I'm finally thinking like a CEO. The room became silent. After a long pause, Mason stood. I don't think we're heading in the same direction anymore. Ellie nodded. I know. He extended his hand. She shook it. There was no argument, no dramatic confrontation, only 2 professionals whose definitions of success no longer matched. As he walked toward the door, Mason stopped. You know. He smiled politely. I misjudged Jonathan. Ellie looked at him. So did I. Mason nodded once, then left. Friday morning brought another surprise. Brian entered Ellie's office carrying a letter. What's that? Insurance renewal. She frowned. So, he smiled. They reduced our premiums. How much? Almost $800,000 annually. Ellie looked stunned. Why? Brian pointed toward the explanation. Improved governance procedures, enhanced contractual risk management, verified compliance controls. She laughed quietly. A month ago, we were complaining about all this paperwork. Brian smiled. Apparently, paperwork has financial value. She remembered Jonathan saying almost the same thing years earlier. The strongest protection is usually the page nobody wanted to read. At the time, she thought he was joking. Now she realized he wasn't. Late Friday afternoon, Jonathan received the latest internal performance report. Robert Kim entered carrying coffee. "I thought you'd appreciate this." Jonathan accepted the report. "What is it?" "Client improvement statistics." Jonathan scanned the first page. Harper Biotechnologies ranked first. Largest compliance improvement, largest documentation accuracy increase, largest reduction in executive correction requests. Robert smiled. "Not bad." Jonathan nodded. "They earned it." Robert studied him. "You seem genuinely happy." "I am." "Even after everything," Jonathan looked toward the window. "This company doesn't exist to prove people wrong." He paused. "It exists to help them become stronger." Robert smiled. "I suppose that's why you've never enjoyed saying, 'I told you so.'" Jonathan laughed softly. "I've never understood the point." That evening, Ellie remained alone in her office after everyone else had gone home. The production floor below continued operating smoothly. Employees moved confidently between laboratories. Shipping schedules remained on time. Contracts no longer returned covered in corrections. She opened her desk drawer. Inside lay the original divorce papers. For several moments, she simply looked at them. Then she quietly placed them back inside. She no longer viewed them with anger, only perspective. Her marriage had ended. That could not be changed. But it had also revealed something she desperately needed to learn before leading a company into the future. She finally understood that leadership was not measured by how quickly people followed. It was measured by how safely they arrived. Across town, Jonathan switched off the lights in his office. On his desk rested one final folder: Harper Biotechnologies. Everything had been reviewed. Every department had completed its work. Every requirement had been satisfied. Only one blank signature line remained. Jonathan picked up his pen. This time he did not pause. Jonathan uncapped his pen. The conference room was empty. The executive floor had grown unusually quiet as evening settled over downtown Columbus. Most employees had already gone home. Only a few office lights remained on. The Harper Biotechnologies file rested neatly in the center of the polished walnut table. Every department had completed its review: legal, financial, insurance, environmental, regulatory, executive governance. Jonathan opened the file one final time. Not because he expected another mistake, because 20 years of habit deserved one final moment of respect. He slowly turned each page. The supplier certifications remained valid. The insurance endorsements matched every jurisdiction. Manufacturing approvals reflected current federal guidance. Distribution agreements aligned with state regulations. Corporate governance policies had been rewritten with remarkable precision. He reached the final page. There it was. Executive authorization, one blank line. Jonathan rested his hand lightly on the paper. His father's voice surfaced in his memory. A signature is a promise. Not a formality, not a privilege, a promise. Jonathan lowered the pen. In one smooth motion, he signed, Jonathan A. Wright. The ink dried within seconds. No applause followed, no music, no celebration. Only the quiet certainty that another responsibility had been fulfilled correctly. He closed the folder, pressed the internal authorization button. The electronic workflow activated immediately. Within seconds, the completed file left executive governance. For Jonathan, the task was finished. For Harper Biotechnologies, everything was about to change. Less than 3 minutes later, Brian Foster's computer chimed. He glanced toward the screen while reviewing another supplier agreement. The notification header appeared. Executive authorization complete. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he opened the file. The signature sat exactly where he had hoped it would. Jonathan A. Wright. Approved. Brian smiled. Not because he had defeated the system, because the system had finally confirmed they had earned its trust. He stood immediately. Instead of calling Ellie, he walked to her office. This news deserved to be delivered in person. He knocked once. "Come in." Ellie looked up from her laptop. Brian handed her the printed approval without saying a word. She looked down. Her eyes found the signature instantly. Jonathan A. Wright. Approved. She didn't speak. Brian quietly broke the silence. "It's finished." She nodded almost imperceptibly. "It's finished." The effects spread faster than anyone expected. At 9:18 the following morning, First Midwest Commercial Bank released the construction financing. At 9:41, the Indiana manufacturing facility received final activation approval. At 10:07, the national insurance carrier issued active coverage certificates. At 10:26, state licensing authorities finalized operational registration. Before noon, 3 major equipment manufacturers confirmed shipment schedules. By early afternoon, every agreement that had remained suspended for weeks began moving almost simultaneously. Rachel hurried into Ellie's office carrying a tablet. "You need to see this." She opened the operational dashboard. Green indicators appeared one after another. Financing, approved, insurance, active, manufacturing, released, distribution confirmed. Rachel laughed. "I've never seen this many approvals in one day." Neither had Ellie. She slowly sat back in her chair. For weeks she had imagined Jonathan standing between her company and its future. Now she understood. He had never been standing in front of the door. He had simply refused to unlock it until the building behind it was strong enough to stand. The atmosphere inside Harper Biotechnologies transformed completely. Employees applauded when the final production schedule appeared on the large monitor. Engineers shook hands. Laboratory supervisors congratulated procurement teams. No one celebrated defeating compliance. They celebrated completing it. Brian watched the scene quietly. A junior attorney walked beside him. "I never thought paperwork could feel exciting." Brian smiled. "It isn't." "What is?" "The confidence that comes with knowing we did it right." The young attorney nodded thoughtfully. "I'll remember that." Later that afternoon, Ellie stood alone inside the new manufacturing facility in Indianapolis. Forklifts moved carefully between production lines. Technicians calibrated equipment. Quality inspectors reviewed temperature controls. Everything operated exactly according to schedule. She remembered how desperately she had wanted these doors to open weeks earlier. If they had, half the compliance improvements now protecting the company would never have existed. She walked slowly through the building. Every completed checklist, every inspection report, every updated procedure, every safeguard. She could trace them back to one decision. Someone had refused to compromise. Across Columbus, Jonathan packed his brown leather lunch bag, just as he did every weekday. Margaret stopped outside his office. "Heard the good news," Jonathan smiled. "I assume they're operational." "They are." She looked pleased. "They're one of the strongest client submissions we've processed all year." Jonathan closed his briefcase. "They worked very hard." Margaret laughed. "You sound like a teacher." "My father used to say something," she smiled. "I've noticed your father had advice for everything." Jonathan laughed quietly. Almost. "What was this one?" "He used to tell me," Jonathan paused. "People appreciate strong foundations only after they stop worrying about the roof collapsing." Margaret looked toward the skyline outside. "I think Harper Biotechnologies finally understands that." "I think they do." She hesitated. "They'll probably want to thank you." Jonathan gently shook his head. "They don't need to." "Why not?" "They already did." Margaret looked confused. "How?" "They improved." She smiled. "I suppose that's the best thank you possible." That evening, Ellie arrived outside Wright Strategic Compliance Group. Not because she had another contract, not because she needed another favor. She simply wanted to express something she had never said. The receptionist greeted her warmly. "I'm sorry." She smiled politely. "Mr. Wright left about 20 minutes ago." Ellie glanced toward the nearly empty parking garage. Only a few vehicles remained. Jonathan's familiar silver Toyota Avalon was gone. She stood quietly for a moment. A security officer walked by carrying a clipboard. "He leaves on time almost every evening." Ellie smiled faintly. "Of course he does." She thanked the receptionist and walked back outside. The evening air felt cool. Traffic moved steadily along the streets below. Somewhere ahead, Jonathan was probably driving home exactly as he always had. No celebration dinner, no interviews, no victory speech. Just another evening. Exactly like hundreds before it. Ellie looked back once at the building. For years, she had believed power announced itself loudly. Now she understood. Real influence often finished its work before anyone realized it had been there. She returned to her car without regret. There was nothing left to say. Jonathan had already said everything that mattered, not with words, with the way he had chosen to live. Winter arrived quietly in Columbus. The first snow of December covered sidewalks, rooftops, and the branches lining High Street with a thin layer of white. For most people, the season marked the end of another business year. For Harper Biotechnologies, it marked the beginning of a new chapter. The Indiana manufacturing facility reached full production ahead of schedule. The Pennsylvania Distribution Center processed its first nationwide shipments. Insurance renewals moved through without unexpected revisions. Bank financing remained stable. Investor confidence returned steadily, not because of ambitious promises, but because every quarterly report demonstrated the same thing. Consistency. Ellie no longer measured success by headlines. She measured it by how few surprises appeared during board meetings. The annual board meeting took place on a cold Thursday morning. Several directors who had questioned the expansion only months earlier now reviewed remarkably different reports. Rachel Simmons stood before the screen. "Our legal revision rate has decreased by 74%. Our regulatory response time has improved by 41%. Our insurance costs have declined by nearly $1 million annually." One director adjusted his glasses. "What changed?" Ellie answered herself. "We changed." He smiled politely. "No." He pointed toward the reports. "You changed the company." Ellie shook her head. "We changed the way we think." Another board member asked, "What was the turning point?" For a brief moment, she considered explaining everything. Jonathan, the contracts, the invisible executive review. Instead, she simply smiled. "We stopped asking how quickly we could finish." She looked around the room. "We started asking whether we had finished correctly." No one argued. The numbers spoke for themselves. Brian Foster had also changed. The attorneys who once feared additional compliance reviews now welcomed them. Every new lawyer joining the company received the same advice during orientation. Brian would place an old binder on the conference table. Inside were copies of Harper Biotechnologies' first rejected submissions. Then he placed another binder beside it. The final approved versions. He never mentioned Jonathan by name. Instead, he said, "Every correction in this room cost us time." He paused. "But every correction also saved us from mistakes we would have carried for years." Young attorneys listened carefully. Some even asked to study the files afterward. The company's culture had shifted permanently. Rachel noticed another change. Employees had stopped celebrating overnight victories. Instead, they celebrated completed systems. One Friday afternoon, the procurement department finished implementing a new supplier verification process. No cameras appeared. No press release followed. Still nearly 50 employees gathered in the break room. Someone brought homemade cookies. Another employee thanked the legal department. An engineer thanked procurement. Procurement thanked quality assurance. Ellie watched quietly from the doorway. She smiled. For years, she had believed leadership meant standing in front. Now she understood that good leadership often meant standing back long enough for everyone else to succeed. Across the city, Jonathan's life remained remarkably unchanged. Every weekday morning, the same silver Toyota Avalon, the same brown leather lunch bag, the same quiet greeting to the security officer, the same office, the same careful review of contracts. The media eventually discovered the identity of the executive behind Wright Strategic Compliance Group. A regional business magazine requested an interview. Jonathan declined. A national legal publication invited him to speak at its annual conference. He politely refused. An industry association offered him an executive leadership award. He thanked them, then asked if the recognition could instead be presented to the entire governance division. Margaret laughed when she heard. "You know they'll keep asking." Jonathan smiled. "They're welcome to." "You'll always say no." He considered the question. "I'll always say yes to the work." She nodded. "And the attention?" He looked toward the contracts waiting on his desk. "Someone else can have that." Several weeks before Christmas, Ellie visited Wright Strategic Compliance Group one final time. This time she had an appointment. No contracts, no legal questions. Only a small, wrapped package. Sarah welcomed her warmly. "Mr. Wright is expecting you." Jonathan stood as she entered. "Merry Christmas." She smiled. "Merry Christmas." She placed the package on his desk. "It's not expensive." "You didn't have to bring anything." "I know." He carefully opened it. Inside rested a simple, framed photograph. The old picture from their first apartment, both of them smiling beside mismatched furniture. On the back, Ellie had written one sentence: "Thank you for believing in building things that last." Jonathan looked at the photograph for several moments, then looked back at her. "Thank you." She smiled. "No speeches today?" He laughed quietly. "I appreciate that." She stood. "I should go." As she reached the door, she paused. "I finally understand something." Jonathan looked up. "What?" "You were never trying to stay in the background." He waited. "You were building a foundation." He smiled gently. "Foundations aren't supposed to be noticed." She nodded. "I know." Then she left. Neither of them looked back. They didn't need to. Some relationships ended with forgiveness. Others ended with understanding. Sometimes understanding was enough. On the final business day of the year, snow fell steadily across Columbus. Employees hurried toward holiday vacations. Jonathan remained in his office, finishing the last executive approvals before the holiday break. One contract involved a regional children's hospital. Another expanded broadband service into rural communities. A third helped finance affordable senior housing. None would ever make national headlines. All of them mattered. Margaret stopped by carrying her coat. "Heading home soon?" "In a few minutes," she smiled. "Big plans." "My sister and nephew are coming for dinner." She laughed. "Still driving that Avalon?" "It still starts every morning. I've been expecting you to replace it." Jonathan looked out the window at the snow-covered parking lot. "When it stops doing its job." Margaret smiled. "I should have known." She wished him a Merry Christmas and left. Jonathan remained alone. He reviewed the final contract waiting on his desk. Everything was complete. Every certification verified. Every disclosure accurate. He picked up his pen. Without hesitation, he signed. Jonathan A. Wright. The same signature. The same careful handwriting. No larger than it had been 20 years earlier. He placed the contract into the completed tray, switched off his desk lamp, picked up the same brown leather lunch bag he had carried for years. Outside the silver Toyota, Avalon waited beneath a light blanket of snow. Jonathan brushed the snow from the windshield with slow, practiced movements. He climbed inside, started the engine. The old sedan settled into its familiar idle. As he drove through the quiet streets of Columbus, traffic lights reflected softly across the snow-covered roads. Nothing about him looked extraordinary. Most drivers passing him would see an ordinary middle-aged man heading home after work. They would never know how many hospitals had opened, how many businesses had grown, how many families had found security because one quiet executive refused to place his signature on anything less than the truth. And Jonathan preferred it that way. Justice had never come from revenge. It came from patience, from preparation, from systems strong enough to protect everyone equally. Most of all, it came from a man who never needed the world to know his name before his work spoke for him. Sometimes the quietest people carry the greatest responsibilities. They don't need expensive titles, constant recognition, or public applause because their confidence comes from preparation rather than attention. Jonathan never tried to prove Ellie wrong. He simply stayed true to the standards he had spent a lifetime building. In the end, it wasn't pride that changed the outcome. It was consistency, patience, and the willingness to let facts speak louder than emotions. Many of us have judged someone too quickly because their life looked ordinary. We often mistake a simple lifestyle for a lack of ambition or a quiet personality for a lack of strength. Yet real character is usually revealed not in moments of success, but in the discipline someone practices when no one is watching. The strongest foundations are almost always hidden beneath the surface, quietly supporting everything built above them. Have you ever been underestimated because people only saw the outside of your life? Or have you ever realized too late that someone you overlooked was carrying far more wisdom or responsibility than you imagined? Share your story in the comments. I'd genuinely love to read it. And if this story reminded you that integrity, patience, and quiet strength still matter, be sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's story follows another ordinary person whose calm decisions change far more lives than anyone ever expected.